Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'm going to provide students with some help studying the second lesson in the Academy's Greek reading course. You can see up on the screen we'll be studying verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. And just to make this clear, if you're coming across this video on YouTube, this video is intended for students who are currently studying Greek Reading 1 course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, where we study the Gospel of St. John to build our Greek vocabulary and become familiar with Greek translation, pronunciation, and other elementary issues in Greek studies. So this is not intended to be some sort of high-level technical exposition of this passage. It's a school lesson for students getting started in Greek studies. In our previous video, I went through the first 5 verses. We took a lot of time to practice pronunciation and pay attention to all the details of pronunciation as we read the first 5 verses, and then we walked through the translation one word at a time. We'll do the same in this lesson, but I'm going to move a little more quickly and spend a little less time on all of the details of pronunciation, just so we can get moving. As a student, you've got control of the video, so you can rewatch and replay any part of the video that you'd like to study more carefully. So I'm not going to waste too much time with review or worry about going too fast, because unlike a class in a classroom, you have the ability to review anytime you want. So I'm going to try to move along as efficiently as I can in these videos. So having said that, we're going to get started with verses 6 through 10 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John in Greek. We'll read through the 5 verses together, paying attention to the details and pronunciation, and then we'll walk through an exposition of every word of the passage to make sure all of the vocabulary and translation is clear. All right? So let's get started excuse me, with verses 6 through 10, reading it together, and then we'll work on the translation. Verse 6. Egeneto anthropos, apestalmenos para Theou. Egeneto anthropos, apestalmenos para Theou. Note the circumflex accent. Remember, that's a rise and a fall in pitch over the vowel or diphthong. Onoma auto Ioannes. Notice there are 2 news together here. So the first nu ends the previous syllable, and the second nu begins the following syllable. So make sure you pause in between them and articulate them both. Listen to how I do it. Ioannes. So verse 6, Egeneto anthropos apestalmenos para Theou, onoma auto Ioannes. Verse 7, notice the rough breathing and the circumflex accent over this diphthong, omicron upsilon. Houtos, eilthen, eis marturian. Hina, marturese, peri tu photos. Notice the acute accent. Photos. Hina, pantes, pisteu so sin. And when you come to a verb in the Greek that's, or any word in the Greek that's difficult to pronounce, just take a break, read it 1 syllable at a time slowly, practice each part, and then put it together, and then once you get the sound and the flow of that word, you'll be able to say it more quickly and comfortably. So just take your time. We see here, pi steu, epsilon, upsilon here is a diphthong, so they're pronounced together. Pisteu sosin, pisteu sosin, pisteu sosin. Hina pantes pisteu sosin, di autu, di autu. Verse 8. Uk, notice the diphthong, omicron, upsilon is pronounced u. Uk, ein, ekeinos, to phos, to phos. Al hina, notice the rough breathing, al hina, marturese, peri tu photos. So verse 8 reads, uk ein ekeinos to phos, al hina marturese peri tu photos. Verse 9. Notice that verse 9 begins with an uppercase eta. Looks like an H in English, but this is an uppercase eta. So this is ein. Have we seen ein yet in this passage? Let me just see real quick. A lowercase ein. I don't see it. Anyway, this is ein. Ein to phos to alethinon. Just read through it slowly. Alethinon, with an acute accent at the end. Alethinon. Next, notice the rough breathing. Ho, photidze, panta, anthropon, erkomenon, es ton kosmon. So let's read verse 9 one more time. Ein to phos to alethinon, ho photidze panta anthropon, erkomenon es ton kosmon. And verse 10. En to kosmo ein. There's an example of the verb ein with a lowercase eta. That's the same verb that we see here at the beginning of verse 9. I was looking for that before and didn't see it. Verse 10. En to kosmo ein, kai ho kosmos di autu egeneto, kai ho kosmos auton uk egno. So verse 10 reads, en to kosmo ein, kai ho kosmos di autu egeneto, kai ho kosmos auton uk egno. So there's our reading of verses 6 through 10 with a few notes on pronunciation. Hopefully it's getting a little easier for you. But let's now work through the exposition, going word by word through the text here. Verse 6. Egeneto anthropos apestalmenos parateu onoma auto Ioannes. Egeneto is a verb. It means there came or there was. You can see in Latin, St. Jerome translated it with the Latin verb fuit. Egeneto, there was, or there came. Next we have the noun anthropos. Anthropos. In English we have the word anthropology, which is the study of man. Anthropology, or anthropomorphic, means to take the form of a man. Anthropomorphic. So anthropos means man. Egeneto anthropos. There came a man. Apestalmenos. Apestalmenos. This is a participle, as you can see, apestalmenos. So it's a verbal adjective. It's a word that functions like an adjective, but it's derived from a verb and has the characteristics of a verb. So if you look at the characteristics which are listed here, you'll see this is pretty complicated. Apestalmenos, it's a participle. It participates in the characteristics of both a verb and a noun. Look at the characteristics. It's perfect tense, and it's passive in voice. And as an adjective, it's masculine and singular, and in this sentence, it's used in the nominative case. All of that grammatical information is packed into this participle form, apestalmenos. We can see that the translation in English is sent, and that St. Jerome translated it as missus, again using a perfect passive participle in Latin to translate it. Apestalmenos means sent. So egeneto anthropos, there came a man, apestalmenos, who was or who had been sent. Sent para theou. So here we have a prepositional phrase. Para theou. Para is a preposition. And here in the parentheses, you can see that I've added the case that's governed by this preposition. So para is going to seek a genitive case as its object. So if we look to the next word, we find theou is in fact a substantive noun in the genitive case. So para theou gives us a prepositional phrase. Para here in this passage is translated from. Para is translated from. In other passages, you'll see it translated differently, dependent on the context. But here we see para theou is translated from God. Egeneto anthropos, there came a man, apestalmenos para theou, sent from God. And if you remember, or if you've studied Latin in Latin Reading 1, you remember that this was translated missus a Deo. And it's good to compare the two languages, because one of the benefits we have as Catholics is that in the Latin Vulgate we have the translation and interpretation of a doctor of the Catholic Church, one of the ancient church fathers, and we actually see his interpretation and translation from the Greek into the Latin. And so if we know Latin and we look at St. Jerome's translation from Greek into Latin, we can see what St. Jerome was thinking as he made this translation. And if you're interested in that, maybe if you're a little older and you're really interested in that process of translation, St. Jerome wrote a letter where he explains his thinking as he approaches the translation of sacred scripture. So it's something worth studying if you'd like to dig into this a little more. If you'd like to know where that letter is, just get in touch with me, because I'll have to look it up real quick to find the exact letter. But St. Jerome explains his method of interpreting and translating sacred scripture, which is helpful for us to understand. So we see missus a Deo in Latin, St. Jerome's translation of this phrase, apestalmenos para theou, sent from God. Next we read the noun onoma, which simply means the name. It means name. The name auto is a pronoun. We see that it's in the dative case, and this is translated onoma auto, the name for him, or for whom. Some translations might say for whom. It's literally onoma auto, the name for him, Ioannes, John. The name for him, John. And the verb was, which you'll find in the translation, is simply understood. It's not in the text. It's added for the sake of easy reading in English. So verse 6, egeneto anthropos, apestalmenos para theou, onoma auto Ioannes. There came a man, apestalmenos para theou, sent from God, onoma auto, the name for him, Ioannes, was John. Verse 7, Houtos eilthen eis marturian, hina marturese peritou photos. hina pantes pisteusosin diautu. So this seventh verse starts with the pronoun hutos, which is equivalent in Latin to hic. So it's the masculine singular demonstrative pronoun, hutos, this. And again, it's masculine. So it's referring back to a subject from the previous verse. And we'd look back and we'd say, well, who is this person that this is referring to? It's referring back to John. Hutos, this man. Then we have the verb eilthen, eilthen, eilthen. And notice in the characteristics here, we're told it's third person singular. This man came. You see, St. Jerome's translation was venit, which is in the perfect tense. This man came could also be considered in the present tense. Now, one of the things that's complicated and confusing about this translation is that we're narrating a history. So we're talking about events that to us are in the past tense, and yet when the story is narrated, sometimes the events are presented as if they're in the present tense because we're sort of going back into time. So we have what's called the historical present tense. Now, if you look at the Greek verb, you'll see that the tense is actually what's called aorist. And I'm going to leave a detailed study of the tenses for Greek grammar, but the aorist tense, what it literally is an indefinite tense. So it doesn't define for us exactly the time of the event. That's what the aorist tense is. It's an indefinite tense. So as we go through this translation, as we study Greek in general, you're going to see that when we come across the aorist tense, because it's indefinite and it leaves room for interpretation, you're going to see that in one place, St. Jerome will use an imperfect tense verb in Latin to translate it. In another place, he'll use a perfect tense verb. In another place, he might use a present tense verb. So you'll notice that in the translation, there's a need for interpretation, and the aorist tense in the Greek allows for that translation. So that's why when people say, what does the Greek text say, as if it's going to settle all interpretive questions and settle all controversies, that's simply not true. We're going to come back to issues of interpretation in many decisions that need to be made in translation, and that's why it's necessary for us to live within the authority of the church when it comes to interpretation. So anyway, eilthen is an aorist tense verse. You'll learn about the aorist tense and all other tenses in Greek grammar, but we see here that St. Jerome translated it venit, which can be present or perfect tense. We're going to translate it with a past tense in this course here. Eilthen, we'll translate it as he came. This man is understood. This came, eilthen. Then we have the prepositional phrase eis marturian, eis marturian. Eis is a preposition that governs the accusative case, or that seeks the accusative case after it. We see the translation here is for, and there can be a number of translations for this preposition. It can be into, unto, for, and so on. You see that St. Jerome translated it with the preposition in, which doesn't help much because in Latin, in can have many different translations as well, or many different meanings. So eis and marturian is in the accusative case because it's the object of that preposition. So eis marturian, we translate this as for a witness or for a testimony. This man came for a witness, came to be. The for expresses the purpose for which he came. He came for a witness. He came to be a witness, we could say. So you can see how much flexibility there is in translation. But in our study, we want to stick to the text. We want to stick to the exact words, and we want to be able to look at the Greek and translate every single word into English and then have a coherent or meaningful translation. So Even though there's lots of room, there's lots of flexibility in translation, when we're studying language, we don't want to make use of that freedom. We want to stick to the words and be able to give an account for every single part of our translation. So, hu tos eothen eis marturian. Let's just keep it very literal and simple. This came for a witness. Okay, keep it very simple. This came for a witness. Hina, conjunction, so that. This man came for a witness so that marturese. Marturese is a verb. You can see all the characteristics listed here. It's third person singular. This man came for a witness so that he might bear witness. Notice in the translation we have the word might. He might bear witness. This is not an indicative verb, so we're not stating a fact. What the Greek actually includes here is this idea of potential, so that he might bear witness. That's what the subjunctive mood does. It distinguishes indicative statements from statements that have other purposes or different we could say modes or manners of expression. The reason why that's so important philosophically is because in reasoning, the only statements that are permissible in reasoning are indicative statements. So when someone wants to state something that's not necessarily factual, but maybe conditional or potential or desired, they'll use the subjunctive mood to show that I'm not indicating this. I'm simply saying this in a different manner. So it's important to see the subjunctive mood when it's listed there in the characteristics and to see how it affects the translation so that he might bear witness. Okay, it's third person singular, it's he. It's referring to John as the subject. Notice again the tense is aorist, so it's got an indefinite tense. It's subjunctive in mood and it's active in voice. So that he might bear witness, marturese. And notice in the Latin that Saint Jerome translated this verb marturese with two words in Latin, testimonium perhiberet, which means the same thing, so that he might bear witness. Perhiberet is subjunctive in Latin, it's imperfect tense, and testimonium is given as the subject. But all of that's included in the verb marturese in Greek. Okay? Notice also in that word marturese, we have this Greek word martyr, which is where we get the word martyr from. So when we say that a Christian is put to death for the faith, we say he's a martyr. What that means is that he's a witness. He's one who bore witness to the truth. John is coming as such a man here. He came for a witness, to be a witness, and he ended up being killed, which is, again, what the word martyr means, a witness. So, hina marturese, so that he might bear witness. Let's keep going here. Peritu photos. Peritu photos. We have another prepositional phrase. Peri is a preposition. It governs the genitive case, as you can see here. And it means concerning or about. You see the Latin translation was de, concerning or about. It takes the genitive case, so we should expect to see a genitive object, and we do in tu photos, a genitive object of the preposition peri. Peri tu photos, concerning tu photos, concerning the light. Photos is light. If you transliterate this, it's where we get the word photo from in English, photo. So photography means to draw with light. Photos, that's the Greek word. Concerning the light. John came so that he might bear witness concerning the light. And you can see the Latin translation is lumine. So lumine is the Latin equivalent for photos, at least in this place. Then we have the conjunction hina again. Hina, so that, this was his purpose, so that pantes, it's an adjective, means all, and it's masculine. So all, and we can understand men, so that all men understood, so that all men pisteusosin. Pisteusosin. This is third person plural verb. It's aorist intense, so it's indefinite intense. And notice again, it's subjunctive in mood, so it's not an indicative statement. It's subjunctive. So that all men might believe. Might believe. Pisteuo means I believe. Pisteusosin means they might believe. And then we have another prepositional phrase, di autu. And notice in the parenthesis here I wrote that di with this apostrophe after it. This is not a breathing mark. This is an apostrophe. It's showing that the alpha at the end of the preposition dia has been dropped. And it's been dropped because the next word starts with alpha. So for the sake of euphony, they drop the alpha at the end of dia and simply read this prepositional phrase as diautu, diautu, almost as one word, diautu, with that alpha dropped. So dia is a preposition that governs the genitive case. It means through. Notice the Latin translation was per, through or by. And then autu is in the genitive case, not because it's expressing possession, so it's not going to be translated of him. It's simply the object of a preposition that requires a genitive case, so it's put in the genitive case. So diautu means through him, through him. So let's go back through verse 7. Hu tos eilthen eis marturian, hina marturese peritu photos, hina pantes pisteusosin diautu. This man, again, man is understood, this came for a witness so that he might bear witness concerning the light, so that all, man is understood, so that all might believe through him, through John's witness. All right, that's verse 7. Verse 8. Uk ein ekeinos tophos al hina marturese peritu photos. Uk ein ekeinos tophos al hina marturese peritu photos. Uk is an adverb. It means not. You see the Latin translation is non, means not. Uk ein. Ein means he was, or we'll see that was. He was uk. He was not ekeinos. Ekeinos is a pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun, equivalent to the Latin ille. So it means that. So we saw hutos in the previous verse. Hutos is equivalent to the Latin hic, means this. Ekeinos is equivalent to the Latin ille. It means that. So keep hutos and ekeinos in mind together because they're the two different demonstrative pronouns. Hutos, this, and ekeinos, that. So ekeinos means that, but here, because it's referring to John, we translate it as he, just like ille. So ekeinos, he, was not, uk ein, tophos, the light, phos. Now, if you look up phos in a dictionary, just as a note, you may see phos listed as masculine, a masculine noun in a dictionary, but here in the Greek text, it's neuter, and we know that because the article that comes before it is a neuter article. So you'll see that I listed phos as neuter, and if you were to check that in the dictionary, you might see that it says masculine, but it's because the article to is being used with it, which is neuter. So uk ein ekeinos, not was he tophos, the light. And phos here is the nominative form of the same word that we saw photos in the previous verse. So photos is the genitive form of the noun phos. This is the nominative case. Okay? So uk ein ekeinos tophos, not was he the light. Pretty simple. Al, and here we have another example of an apostrophe where a word is shortened for the sake of euphony or pleasant pronunciation. The word, if you look it up in a dictionary, is actually alla. It means but. It's a conjunction, translated said in Latin. But it's abbreviated here. You see the apostrophe marking the omission of that alpha at the end. And the reason why is because the following word begins with an aspirated vowel, hina. So to say alla hina is sort of messy. And so they just drop that final alpha and say alhina, which is easier to pronounce. And again, that's called euphony, just making changes to a language to help with the articulation, to help it be articulated more smoothly, and also to make it more pleasant to listen to. So we have alhina, but, so that. So not was he, the light, but so that marturese, he might bear witness, peri tou photos, concerning the light. We've already translated that phrase in the previous verse. So verse 8, uk ein eke nos tophos alhina marturese peri tou photos. Not was he the light, but that he might bear witness concerning the light. That's verse 8. Verse 9. Remember, this looks like an uppercase H, but it's actually an uppercase eta in Greek. And you'll notice that the breathing mark and the accent are set before that initial vowel. So just keep all that together as you read this. It's not aspirated, and it's got a circumflex accent. So ein. Ein is the verb that means it was. Ein tophos, it was the light. Ein tophos to alethinon. To alethinon. So we've got this phrase here. You've got the article repeated, and the article gets repeated simply to show us that this adjective, alethinon, is referring to this substantive, phos. To phos, to alethinon. And in English, we could translate this literally if you want to. We could say, it was, or he was, the light, the true. The light, the true. Again, that may make it easier for you to remember the Greek when you translate. The light, the true, or you could just say the true light. He was, or it was, the true light, the true. Ho. Now, this may look like the article, as we see down here. Let me just show you this real quick. Down here in verse 10, we see ho kosmos, and this is the definite article, which is translated the. But that's not the same as this word here in verse 9. This word here, ho, is a pronoun. You can see the characteristics here. It's a pronoun, and notice that it looks like the masculine definite article, but it's actually not the definite article, and it's not masculine. It's actually the neuter pronoun. All right, so ha is a relative pronoun. It's translated as which. So he was, or it was, the light, the true, which, and then we have the verb photidze, which you can see down here is simple present tense indicative verb, third person singular, present indicative. He was the true light which, or I should say it was the true light, since the pronoun here is neuter. That would make more sense. It was the true light which photidze, which shines or enlightens. You can see the translation that St. Jerome chose was illuminat, which illuminates. It was the true light which illuminates panta anthropon. Panta anthropon. Panta, you've got to be careful with. It's an adjective. It means all or every. But if you look it up in a grammar book, you'll see that panta could be a neuter plural form. But here it's not neuter plural. It's actually a masculine singular form. So be careful with this. It's masculine singular. Hophotidze, which illuminates or illumines panta anthropon, every man. So all would not be a good translation for panta. Every is better because the subject that it's referring to is singular. Anthropon, man. Panta anthropon, every man. And you can see that down in the details. Anthropon is masculine singular accusative, and therefore the adjective that describes it has to also be masculine singular and accusative. You see also that St. Jerome noted this in the translation because he translated panta with a singular adjective, omnem, not omnes, plural, but omnem, singular, and he translated anthropon with the singular accusative form hominem, omnem hominem, panta anthropon, all right? Every man. Then we have the participle erkomenon, erkomenon. Participle, remember, participates in the characteristics of both a verb and an adjective. So it works in the sentence like an adjective, but it has tense, which makes it like a verb as well. It's present tense, it's masculine, singular, and accusative because it's describing anthropon, which illuminates every man, erkomenon, coming, present tense, active, coming, eis ton kosmon, eis. Now, before I told you that the preposition eis can have a number of different meanings in English. And here, in this verse, we see that it's got a different meaning. Here it means into. So eis plus the accusative case is translated into. Earlier, let me just find it real quick, back in verse 7, we saw the same preposition, eis marturian, for a witness, eis marturian. So we see that same preposition 2 verses later, right, or 2 verses later, translated differently, translated into. And notice it's the same in Latin, so St. Jerome used the same preposition in Latin, but when moving from the classical languages to English, these prepositions have a number of different possible meanings in English, which is where the confusion comes from. It's not in the classical languages, it's in English, in translation. So here in verse 9, eis ton kosmon is going to be translated as into the world. Erkomenon, coming, eis ton kosmon, into the world. Note that the word kosmon, if you transliterate it, gives us the English word cosmos, so C-O-S-M-O, cosmo. Cosmo, which means the world, so cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan means a world-class city. Cosmo, a cosmonaut. A cosmonaut is referring to the heavens in this case. Naut refers to a sailor. Cosmonaut means one who sails through the heavens, an astronaut, one who sails to the stars. So kosmon, the world. So verse 9, just to review, ein tophos to alethinon, chofotidze panta anthropon, erkomenon eis ton kosmon. It was the light, it was the true light, which illuminates panta anthropon, every man, erkomenon, coming into the world. And lastly, verse 10, en to kosmo ein, kai ho kosmos diautou egeneto, kai ho kosmos auton uk egno. Now, what's kind of cool here is that we get to see this noun, ho kosmos, in 3 different cases in just 2 verses here. So we have ton kosmon in verse 9, ton kosmon, which is the accusative case. We then have to kosmo, which is the dative case of that same noun. And then we have ho kosmos, which is the nominative case. So we get to see one word in 3 different cases in just one passage of Scripture, which helps us to see the functions of cases and how the different forms are used to serve different purposes in the language. So verse 10, en to kosmo. We have the preposition en, which means in, and it's followed by the dative case. Now notice the confusion in translation. St. Jerome has used the Latin preposition in for 3 different prepositional phrases that we've seen. Eis marturian, where it translates as for, eis ton kosmon, where it translates as into, and now here, en to kosmo, he translates it in, which means literally in the world. So we've seen that flexibility in the prepositions when translating to English. So just keep an eye on these prepositions and realize that if you look them up in a dictionary, and I always recommend that you keep a dictionary on hand anytime that you do translation work, look up the preposition and see the full range of meaning that it has. Because you'll see all of the options in English, all of the ideas in English that are signified by this one word. And you've got to sort of keep yourself open-minded when translating and realize that the translation can include any of those possible meanings. So the work of translation is difficult. It's not straightforward. If there are questions about interpretation and things like that, those questions are not always going to be solved by looking at the original language, because there are just more questions of interpretation to be found in the original languages and in their translations. So pay attention to those ranges of word meanings and realize how helpful it is for us to have St. Jerome's translation from Greek into Latin to study as Catholics. So this phrase en to kosmo is the preposition en, which takes a dative case. So to kosmo is the dative case of that noun kosmos. So en to kosmo, in the world ein. We've seen this verb multiple times, ein, he was. In the world he was. Kai ho kosmos, and ho kosmos, the world. And the world, we have the prepositional phrase diautou, diautou. And again, notice it's abbreviated. So we have dia, through, autou, through him, egeneto, the verb egeneto. We see it's third person singular, and it's aorist, so it's indefinite intense, and it's indicative, and it says deponent. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but if you see deponent as a characteristic of a verb, deponent is a verb, it's a mood of it's a voice of a verb. And what that means is the verb is going to have a passive or middle voice appearance, but it's going to have an active translation. So deponent looks like a passive, but works like an active verb. So egeneto is translated was made, was made. The world, ho kosmos, egeneto, the world was made. Notice St. Jerome's translation in Latin was factus est, which was a passive translation. So you see there's some confusion there because egeneto is listed as a deponent verb, but here it's got, it appears to have a passive translation. So you can just mark that verb there with an asterisk. Notice that same verb egeneto, we saw it at the beginning of this passage, egeneto. We saw it here with a clearer deponent use with an active meaning. There came, or there was. There came a man sent from God. So egeneto there was translated there came. Down here in verse 10, we see the same verse translated was made. So we might want to actually correct this and say in this passage, egeneto is not being used in a deponent sense, but in a simple passive sense. And that's why St. Jerome translated it as factus est. Again, we have the translation work of St. Jerome to help us. So that's a good little controversy to get into there, seeing a verb used in 2 different ways. But I don't want to dig into that too much. So let's just keep going. It's translated was made. So the world was made diautou, through him. Kai, the conjunction and, ho kosmos, and the world, auton, in the accusative case, the world him, uk egno. Uk is the adverb not, and egno, you see it's third person singular, it's aorist, intense, and indicative. Egno means did know. You see the Latin cognovit. Notice that the aorist tense here, which is indefinite in Greek, was translated by St. Jerome with a perfect tense verb. So we've seen him use different verb tenses to translate the aorist tense in Greek, and that's the whole point of the aorist tense. It's indefinite. So uk egno, not did know, did not know, non cognovit in Latin. So verse 10 to finish up here. En to cosmo ein, kai ho cosmos diautou egeneto, kai ho cosmos auton uk egno. In the world he was, and the world through him is made, or was made. Kai ho cosmos, and the world auton uk egno, him not did know. So there's our translation of verses 6 through 10. We've gone through every word in the translation. Everything was pretty smooth, except for some what are called multifarious translations of prepositions. And also a little interesting note about the verb egeneto. Down here at the bottom of the lesson, I've given the English text of the Douay-Rheims Bible. Now that's not a good translation for anyone studying Greek, because the Douay-Rheims translation is a translation of the Latin Vulgate. But what I'd like you to do is look at that text, because this is an approved Catholic Bible translation. Look at the text of the Douay-Rheims Bible, compare it to our word-by-word translation of the Greek text, and note if there are any differences and why those differences might exist, because those are matters of interpretation, which of course the Church has the authority to make. So pay attention to any differences, because those differences will likely be significant. Not really in translation, because the language is what it is, but in interpretation of how that language is best translated into English language. So that makes for an interesting study. To wrap up here, having studied all of that, gone through all of the exposition, let's just read through verses 6 through 10 one more time to bring this lesson to a nice and neat completion. So let's read verses 6 through 10. Egeneto anthropos apestalmenos paratheu, onoma auto Ioannes. Verse 7. Hu tos euthen eis marturian, hina marturese peritu photos, hina pantes pisteusosin di autou. Verse 8. Uk ein ekeinos tophos, al hina marturese peritu photos. Verse 9. Ein tophos to alethinon, ho photidze panta anthropon, komenon eston kosmon. Verse 10. Ento kosmo ein, kai ho kosmos diautou egeneto, kai ho kosmos auton uk egno. So that's all for verses 6 through 10 in this second lesson in Greek Reading 1. I hope that's a helpful walk through the text. I know that's a lot of information, and I went through it very quickly with very little review as we went. But you can review this video, replay any parts that aren't clear, and if there's anything that you just can't wrap your head around, contact me on the student forum, on the Greek Reading course page, or send me an email, and I'll help you out. So I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.